today's webinar is how weathercasters are improving public understanding of climate change. And this is brought by the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, which I'll just introduce very briefly. And while we're waiting for this to start, it'd be great to get to know the audience a little bit, who's here. So if you'd like to put your name and where you're from, and maybe what gets you out of bed in the morning. For me, I think of weathercasters as sort of, the first up and telling us what's going to be ahead of us for the days and weeks. So what gives you climate optimism? And then in terms of the conferences, so my name is Miriam. I'm a postdoc here at the California Institute for Energy and Environment, one of the organizing conveners of the BECC conference, along with ACEEE and Stanford. And I just joined last year. I recently joined the BECC organizing committee, and it's a really great organization. I'm glad to be a part of this. We have some exciting announcements. You are currently in the virtual BECC monthly webinar. So we got a lot of feedback from you, our BECC attendees, and we've decided to move to a biennial schedule with a BECC conference. So our next in-person conference is going to be November 12th to 15th, and that's the in-person component. That will be every other year. And then the virtual component, the following year, will be focusing on virtual component like this, the monthly webinar. And the 2023 theme is driving transformation. Early bird registration is now open until July 31st. So don't delay, register today. And a huge thank you to our 2023 sponsors. None of this would be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. And if you're interested in sponsoring, if you'd like to see your name up here, please reach out to info@beccconference.org. We're really grateful for the support of our sponsors. And I'm excited to share information about our next webinar. This is going to be in June. And we were going to be looking at what can we learn about changing behavior from energy saving programs and grassroots initiatives around the world. And this is going to be featuring local leaders across sub-Saharan Africa who share their climate action stories. And I believe the link for registration will be available shortly after this webinar. You're all probably pros at Zoom, but just a couple of housekeeping tips. Please keep please remain muted, but we love seeing your webcam. It's optional, but really encouraged. Use the chat. We really encourage your questions and comments throughout, and I'll be moderating the chat throughout. And then we're gonna wait until the end of the webinar for a lively question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And now to briefly introduce today's webinar. Professor Ed Maybach is professor at George Mason University and the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication. And Ed's research focuses on public understanding of climate change and strategies to enhance it. Ed previously was worldwide director of social marketing at Porter Novelli and the associate director for the National Cancer Institute. He's a fellow of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science and is an elected National Academy of Medicine member, and he serves on the Global Climate and Health Alliance Board of Directors. Bernadette Wood-Plackey is Chief Meteorologist and the Director for Climate Central's Climate Matters. Bernadette developed partnerships with media organizations, nonprofits, and academic institutions in her leadership role with Climate Central, and she serves as an expert on the linkages between climate change and weather. Before coming to Climate Central, Bernadette worked for decades as an on-air meteorologist with markets in Arkansas, Kentucky, and Maryland. And she has a bachelor in meteorology and a minor in French from Penn State. And she carries both of the American Meteorological Society certifications, television seal of approval, and certified broadcast meteorologist. And without any further ado, I'm delighted to pass it over to Ed and Bernadette.
Thank you, Miriam. Both for the invitation and for the gracious introduction. And if you could just confirm that you are seeing our slides.
Yes.
Yes, awesome. So Bernadette, my dear friend Bernadette, and I are so grateful for the opportunity to share the work we've been doing together over the past 10 years. on the Climate Matters project. We're going to take you on a deep dive through it, but a fairly quick pass. But it is I want to tell you a story of our work, and I wanted to share the moral of the story in advance, because I actually want you to track what I consider to be sort of the key lessons from this incredible work. And the first lesson is the fact that when we have information worth sharing, like really important information for people to know, we really do know how to do that well. There's a formula for simple, I call it the evidence-based guidelines for effective communication campaigns. And it's simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted and caring voices. So I hope you see that going through our presentation. But the second moral of this story is that simply sharing what we know is one thing. But if we're really trying to encourage people to change their actions, change what they do, we have to think in a slightly different way. And what the evidence base suggests for that is it's everything that we can do to make the behavior that we're promoting easy, fun, and popular, which is distinct from simply sharing information. So taking the behavior that we're promoting, making it easy, making it fun, and making it popular. In the case of the story that Bernadette and I are going to tell you, it's really the behavior of TV weathercasters across America that we were interested in influencing with the Climate Matters program. So again, I encourage you to keep your eyes on those two morals as we go through this story. My colleague at Yale, Tony Leiserowitz, he and I have been conducting national public opinion polls twice a year since the fall of 2008. And in our very first poll in the fall of 2008, we asked people how much do they trust a variety of different types of people with regard to information they can share about global warming. And what we learned is that TV weathercasters back in 2008 were the third most trusted source of information, which came as something a surprise to us. Most trusted was scientists, second most trusted was friends and family, third most trusted TV weathercasters. Within a week of publishing that finding in our Climate Change in the American Mind report, got a call from a local TV weathercaster here in the Washington, D.C. area, a very senior weathercaster named Joe Whitty. And Joe said, Ed, this is really amazing. I had no idea my colleagues and I, were so trusted as a source of information about global warming. I'd like to come up and talk to you and brainstorm some ideas about how we can make that actionable. And a week or so later, he was in my office, and while I had made the case to him that he and other broadcast meteorologists are highly trusted, he made the case to me at our very first meeting that TV meteorologists have a whole bunch of other incredible attributes that make them uniquely positioned to help Americans across the country understand the local personal relevance of global climate change. And he taught me that, not all, but most TV weathercasters are in fact trained meteorologists. All of them have incredible science communication skills. That's how they got their jobs on air, and that's how they advance in their jobs on air. He showed me the sort of Nielsen data proving that back in 2008, and it is still the case today in 2023, that broadcast meteorologists have both diverse audiences as well as incredibly devoted audiences. Local news wouldn't exist anymore if it weren't for the broadcast meteorologists, because that's the number one reason why people still tune in to local news, because they really viewers are very interested in what broadcast meteorologists have to say, and they really do have their favorites. And then finally, Joe made the case to me that nobody is more on the front lines of how global climate change is changing communities nationwide than broadcast meteorologists. They are literally reporting on it every single day, whether they know it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not. And so this sort of a constellation of factors really did suggest to us back in 2008 that TV meteorologists have a unique opportunity to help Americans understand the realities of global warming in their lives, in their communities. The very first thing that we did, we got some funding from the National Science Foundation, and the very first thing that we did was we conducted a survey of weathercasters around the country. the first scientific survey of the broadcast meteorology community in the US. And this is the one and only time my research has wound up on the front page of the New York Times. It's not exactly the way I would have liked to have seen it reported, but it was true. What we found in that survey was that in 2010, when we conducted that survey, the broadcast meteorology community in America was a community divided right down the middle on the issue of human-caused climate change. Half of the weathercaster community accepted the science that human-caused climate change is a reality. And of that half, virtually all of them told us in response to our survey that they would like to educate their viewers about how global climate change is changing weather conditions in their community. But virtually all of them said, we're not doing it yet. Some of them were doing it off air in community presentations and maybe online, but none of them were doing it on air in 2010. The other half of the community, however, to a greater or lesser degree, they weren't yet in sync with climate scientists. They weren't yet accepting of the fact that either climate change was happening at all or that it was human caused. And this is a really important part of our story because trying to introduce ourselves into a community divided on this issue and working with only half of the community struck us as a fairly perilous proposition. America seems to be a nation that, or seemed back then to be a nation largely divided on the issue of climate change. And we found the same was true of the broadcast meteorology community. We decided the next step in our journey was to actually test the premise. If we worked to help broadcast meteorologists educate members of their community about the local impacts of global climate change in their community, would it make a difference? Or would it not make a difference? Because if it wasn't going to make a difference, we weren't really interested in putting a whole lot of our time and our lives into supporting the broadcast meteorology community. This was a fairly big ask that we made in 2010. We put out the word to the broadcast meteorology community looking for some volunteers. This wonderful gentleman by the name of Jim Gandy, he was at the time, he was the chief meteorologist at the CBS station in Columbia, South Carolina. At the time, they were third in the Nielsen ratings. But Jim and his news director, Mary Beth Jacoby, and their general manager, whose name I cannot remember, they said, yeah, we'd like to try this. Actually, we think it's a really important thing for us to do here in Columbia. We realized that it might not go well because Columbia is a pretty conservative place, but we think it's the right thing to do. And because we all agree, and our chief meteorologist is just the guy to do it, we said, well, we want to work with you. So we spent the next year helping Jim take national climate data and downscale it to Columbia, South Carolina. In other words, we took data that NOAA provided to us, the National Weather Service and their parent organization, NOAA, and we only looked at how conditions were changing in Columbia over the past 50 or 100 years, depending on the nature of the data. And on some of the stories, we also looked at what the climate projections were, the climate forecasts, if you will, of how conditions would change over the next 50 or 100 years in some cases. And so Jim ran, over the course of the one-year pilot test that we did with Jim, he ran 13 stories about once per month. He put those stories on his station's website. In addition to them being broadcast live, he put them on his website, and he also created a blog on his station's website during the course of the year to sort of elaborate on those stories. And what we did is we surveyed local news viewers in Columbia, both before the pilot test started in summer of 2010, and again 1 year later after the pilot test was over in the summer of 2011. We surveyed both one group in 2010 and the same group in 2011, randomly selected set of news viewers. And then we also selected a second group, a second randomly selected group of local news viewers, two related but slightly different research designs, both of which showed us the same thing. Jim's 13 stories, the efforts that he made over the pilot test year to educate his viewers about how global climate change is changing their weather in Columbia already, had an impact such that the WLTX viewers, the CBS station viewers, were more likely to come to understand climate change as a personally relevant issue. It changed their views in a whole variety of different ways, but basically the bottom line is they came to see it as more relevant to their lives, which is exactly the simple, clear message that we had hoped Jim would be able to convey through his trusted voice through this Climate Matters program. Mary Beth Jacoby, his news director, this was her rationale for why they did what they did, why they took a chance and started this Climate Matters program with us. She said that our audience can actually feel what's going on. It's happening right outside. Now what we're doing is helping them understand it. And that's what we in the news were supposed to do, inform our community. I just love the way she put that. Over the course of the next several years, by the way, the happy ending of this pilot test story is that WLTX, Jim and Mary Beth's station, went from third in the Nielsen ratings to first in the Nielsen ratings. So while it's true that they may well have ruffled a few feathers among their viewers, more importantly, what they did is they actually improved the bottom line of their station. It might not all be attributable to the Climate Matters program, but certainly the Climate Matters program did not create problems for them. It turned out to be a real asset and boost to their brand in the market. An additional thought that we started with, the way we developed Climate Matters with Jim and his team at WLTX, we knew we wanted to develop an approach that could work for any weathercaster anywhere in the country. So we didn't just create a program that was going to work only in Columbia and only at the CBS station, but we intentionally created a model to support what we are calling a community of practice. TV weathercasters as a community of practice, approximately 2,200 people nationwide. So very intentionally, our design specification from the get-go were to design an approach that any weathercaster in any station anywhere in the country could implement. Fairly early on, in the spring of 2014, so only Bernadette will give you a sense of the timeline in a moment, but only about a year or two after we started scaling the program up nationwide, offering it to weathercasters who wanted to participate, the third national climate assessment was released. President Obama chose his only time spent trying to amplify the findings of the National Climate Assessment was actually spent in the Rose Garden with about 10 different broadcast meteorologists, I think 9 of which by that point were already participating in the Climate Matters program, which we thought we were really honored by that and really pleased by that because it showed that President Obama and his team understood that local TV weathercasters are trusted voices in their community, perhaps even more so than the President of the United States. And so President Obama chose to work with 10 local weathercasters to help them or encourage them to get the word out about the findings of the National Climate Assessment. Coming back to that community divided that I talked about a moment ago, by 2011, the community was starting to trend towards more acceptance of human-caused climate change. They were up to, the second time we surveyed a year later, they were up to 54%. But fast forward to 2017, by this point, 95% of the broadcast meteorology community in America was now understanding of or accepting of the scientific realities that human-caused climate change is already a reality and is already changing conditions in our communities. This is a huge shift in the opinions of this community of practice of broadcast meteorologists. It isn't an accident that it happened. We set out from the get-go to address the fact that the community was divided, the community of broadcast meteorologists, and we actually brought in an expert in the field of conflict analysis and resolution. She's, at the time, she was the dean of our School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution here at George Mason. Her name is Sarah Cobb. She is the mother of rock star climate scientist Kim Cobb. So Sarah was pretty well briefed on climate change as an issue. And when I invited her to come in and help develop conflict resolution strategies to address this community of practice, It was amazing how effective it was and how quickly it was effective. And I'll simply say, I'll summarize the impact of that conflict resolution activity. The conflict came down to a single word: respect, or lack thereof. A significant number of weathercasters felt disrespected by climate scientists and by their colleagues in the broadcast community who were already on board with human-caused climate change, i.e. the results of climate science. And once we got down to the fact that they felt disrespected and hurt as a result, it really, it put in place a very different dynamic between members of these communities. There was a whole lot less overtly disrespectful behavior, conversation going on between among members of this community, and it really did help to sort of drain the emotion, the acrimony out of the conversation within the community of practice, which allowed those who weren't yet on board to very rapidly change their views and realign their views with the realities of climate change. So with that, I want to turn it over to Bernadette Plackey, who will actually take us through sort of what this program looks like on a more tactical level.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And thank you, Miriam. I always love hearing Ed tell the story. He's such a great storyteller. So that was the setting, but there's a lot more that happened from there. His point of respect is, you know, it's important to identify that, but then how do you move through that? How do you move past that? How do you build these bonds? And so there were a few different ways we really approached this, and I'll boil them down to 3 buckets, but there's a lot more that really you can unpack from each of these buckets. One of these is education. TV meteorologists in general consider themselves scientists. And so they had questions at a different level than other people. And they weren't ready to go forward with certain messages or connections to climate until they understood and they could speak about them. And so we did a lot on the realm of education, from workshops and webinars and going to key conferences and events. And on top of that too, one of the things that carries through all 3 of these buckets is listening to where they were, where their questions were. This is really critical because sometimes as a climate community, people impose thoughts on others, right? And that's sometimes what you hear in the disrespect, but it's also just because they're not where we are with climate yet doesn't mean they're not interested. So where were those issues or barriers so that we could work through those? The second is weekly, local, timely content. And all of this still goes on today. I'll take you through some examples of this in just a moment, but we do produce from this office weekly packages of reporting resources that are timely and can be brought into weathercasts across the country. It is localized to over 240 cities across the US. And then in addition to that, we created some tools to help get this content out in even more effective ways when there is a climate trigger in your area. On top of that, the third bucket really covers a lot of different things, so it's hard to summarize, but it was the community building and the network support. We get approached with so many different fun and wide-ranging projects that we've gotten brought into because of our partnership with TV meteorologists, and so I just sort of put it under that bucket here. So let's get through some examples here, and we can click forward and show you. Here's an example of our weekly Climate Matters. We do this in Spanish and in English, and this is one recent example from a couple of weeks ago, really diving into how, I mean, who doesn't love trees, right? But the value of trees and the power of trees and how this is making for cleaner air. It's sucking up more rainfall to prevent flooding. It also provides shading, so cooling in urban areas. And so that's what we really dove into there. And you see, the way we package this together is what's the latest science. We have a whole narrative around that. I didn't put that whole thing in the screenshot here, but you see some of the graphics. They are localized to the 240 different locations around the US. We also pitch ideas on how you can make this a local story to go even further with that storytelling. Some of the experts that we've been in touch with to build out this Climate Matters who are willing to be interviewed, and ways you can take that even further. We also always have a methodology with our local analysis and data that we provide too. So there's just one example, and we have all of this on our website from over 10 years of content. So a lot of really good story ideas there. And so I can't go through all of them, but to show you a couple of other really good tools to help bring climate messages into weathercasts. This is the Climate Shift Index. And for those who haven't really followed attribution science, It's a fascinating aspect of climate science that has advanced dramatically over the past 20 years. Now we're at a point, both with the scientific knowledge and with technology, that we can look at daily temperatures and the role of climate change within those daily temperatures. This is all documented. This is published research, and it's all on our website. And this is a tool to help do that. And I took a screenshot. This is today. Low temperatures. There's a climate fingerprint on the low temperatures across the West there. You actually see some gray in the Northeast here, and that's because of the cool front that went through. And so some of the cool mornings we're getting right now are that much less likely with climate change. So we're not going to get those as often going forward. So here's another one that we've got too. Some of our meteorologists who've been bringing this in addition to a great way to connect weather and climate for weathercasters through attribution, this is also a way to go from occasional storytelling to almost daily storytelling where it is relevant in your area. So we're seeing that happen across the country right now. We'll move on to the next one and show you one of the things we're doing going into this summer, and we'll have the sign up form at the end of this, so you can sign up too. It's not just for meteorologists and journalists. Anyone can get this content. But one of the things we're doing with this summer is, we called it the Heat Squad. So internal, we want to get t-shirts and hats, Heat Squad. But we know with this new tool, the climate fingerprint on these heat waves that are already coming. So instead of being reactive to narratives, there's an opportunity to get out ahead of these heat waves, because we're also meteorologists and we can forecast. So this was an example of what we put out last week when we saw that heat wave building in the Northwest. And I saw a couple of people on here were from Portland. I think it was Portland, Oregon. I wasn't sure if it was Maine or Oregon. But you know, if you're in this area or if you've been following the weather, that this is some extreme heat that happened after some really cool weather. So that spike really pushes the health risk so early in the year, especially for vulnerable populations. We were able to package this together and get this out to our network. And so it was an opportunity to make that climate connection ahead of the event. And the Heat Squad's going to continue through the summer, probably forever. But if you want Heat Squad alerts too, you sign up for Climate Matters, you will get those. So here's another one too. You know, we focus so much on the impacts because they're tough, they're hard, and we have to help people understand those climate connections in our weather impacts so that we stay safe and prepared going forward. But the interesting thing with weather is it's not just an impact, but it's also a solution. So we've created a weather-powered tool, and what that does is it pairs current installations of wind and solar with a weather forecast, and it spits it out in various geographies and equivalencies. But this is messaging of how weather is powering society, and it is one of our key solutions going forward. Now, those of us who are in the climate space know that there are a lot of things we need, but we do have this technology already in place. And with some of the climate bill that just went through, there's a lot of ways this is expanding. It's creating healthier communities. It's creating independence on energy, and it's creating a lot of jobs. So this is an opportunity to connect weather with solutions going forward too. So that's just a snapshot of some of the products that we put out and really just helping people connect those messages in ways that matter. So if we go over to this next one here, I want to show you, this is how the program has grown over time. We started with Jim. Then that first year, we kept it to about a dozen just to make sure we could do this on a regular basis. And we've just absolutely exploded since those. You can see year after year, just how many meteorologists have joined this program. And we've also expanded to journalists at this point too, because we have so much great content. So the next graphic is going to show you just a snapshot of our timeline. Now, a lot has happened in between these years, but some of the big ones are the big pilot project with Jim Gandy in 2010, then making this a full-time weekly program in 2013, and quickly after getting another National Science Foundation grant to really scale that program. We jumped into Spanish translation from 2014. So everything we have is also in Spanish. And a lot of our tools in general that we have on our website at Climate Central are also in Spanish. We work with a dear friend, John Morales, who's also a TV meteorologist in translation. So he helps not just with the language translation, but the scientific translation too, which is so key. 2015, we started some of this work globally, working with this global network of TV weather presenters. And then we expanded with another grant from the NSF to get in front of journalists and help them make these connections, because there's so many more climate stories to be told. But even those journalists that just get thrown into weather, there's so many resources for them to make those connections. And we're starting to see that more and more, but we still have a ways to go. See the weather powered tool, also a reporting masterclass. This was our COVID project when we couldn't go to people anymore. We created a tool for them to use that. And then the climate shift index, which I just showed you. So if we move forward here, I want to give you another sort of summary. This is working. This is working because take a look, even during that COVID year, when a lot of climate broadcasts took a hit for obvious reasons, right? We were in a pandemic. However, our network did not drop. They didn't grow as rapidly, but when we trained and worked with this community and really partnered with them and always viewed this as a partnership, you know, they're in this also. You see that they understood. So we taught them to fish and they kept on fishing and they continued making those connections in relevant ways. And we continue to see that growth today. So quick summary of some fun stats here is we have over 1,000 TV meteorologists. Actually, I meant to update that number of journalists. I apologize. It is at about 1,300 right now. I was waiting for the latest number, so I missed that one. NSF grants, we've had 3 to really scale this work and work together with a whole host of partners. Ed and I have worked with NASA and NOAA and Yale at times. Also, the American Meteorological Society has been fantastic. We've had over 70 plus webinars, over 560 Climate Matters releases. So you can go to a really big library to find content and a ton of graphics that we have produced that you can use for anything really, your social media, presentations, anything you're doing here. So just a quick snapshot here. We're not going to play this video. I will drop the link in the chat here, but this is a fantastic video. It's about 6 or 7 minutes, and this is Elisa Rava. She's just a rock star. She's amazing, but she tells the story of her progression, and it's just a fantastic story. I really suggest that you take a look at it. And to summarize what we've learned from really the operational sense, and then Ed's going to get into what we've done on the published sense. But this is what we've learned from our community. I can show you this graphic here too, because I think a lot of this you can apply to your work also, regardless if you're in media or with Weathercasters or whatever, is knowing your audience really is the golden rule of communication, but it is so often overlooked. Really unpack that with tone and topic and timing of when you connect on things. Personalize and localize. Now, this is a global issue, right? But you feel it personally, you act locally, and simplify. Not everyone is as into climate change as we are. We know that. So that doesn't make them bad or wrong. This is an opportunity for us to connect with them. And I always say, act like you're talking to your grandmother. I mean, my grandmother is not some high-level scientist, but maybe yours is. But if not, you know, you want them to understand and you respect them. And they're just not following the lingo and the ins and the outs like you are. Stories are always powerful. There's books on, you know, the stories of time, how they've really helped us open minds and learn things along the way. And don't be afraid. You've got science and public opinion on your side. People have questions and they actually want to talk about this, and people just aren't doing it. So this is what we've learned, and we really encourage you, if you need a prompt, we've got lots of them. Go through the library, start getting our Climate Matters, and then we'll remind you at the end here too, but I have a graphic. Stripe, that little stripe that we have at the bottom there, many of you probably know what that is, but that's the Show Your Stripes from Ed Hawkins. And we're going to do Show Your Stripes Day once again this year with him on June 21st. The reason we've settled on that day is it's because the season of the biggest extremes really kicking off. So it's an opportunity to prompt climate conversation. So with that, Ed, handing it back to you.
Thanks, Brian. So I shared with you the results of our pilot test in Colombia. It worked like a charm. It worked exactly as designed. We have done several other impact evaluation studies along the way. One of those was a study that we published in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society in 2020. We worked with Tammy Souza, who at the time was a senior broadcast meteorologist in Chicago, and John Morales, who Bernadette mentioned earlier, who was a senior broadcast meteorologist in Miami. And we had Tammy and John essentially produce three Climate Matters segments. They were about 3 minutes each, which is longer than usual, but nevertheless, we were interested in testing we recruited people from Miami, recruited another cohort from Chicago, and we randomly assigned them to either listen to 3 Climate Matters segments that Tammy produced, or in Miami, 3 Climate Matters segments that John produced, or if they were in the other group, the control group, if you will, they listened to essentially 3 recent weather reports from Tammy and John. So we were trying to test the impact of when we give people a modest but adequate, what we hoped would be adequate dose of climate education through a trusted local source, a local weathercaster, will it make a difference in the way they see the issue? Will they come to see it as more personally relevant? And the total dose was, I'm sorry, the segments were 2 minutes apiece, because I now see on my own slide that the total dose was 6 minutes. So 3 2-minute Climate Matters segments or 3 2-minute weathercasts. And what we found is that even with this really minimal educational intervention, we saw some very strong effects, all of which are detailed on the slide, but the bottom line of which is people came to see it as more personal, more likely to be relevant to them, and to have a greater sense of understanding how climate change works and a greater interest in learning more about it, which really creating greater interest in learning about a problem, that really should, and I do consider that to be a success of an indicator of successful communication. Because in 6 minutes, you can only share so much. But if you stimulate a desire to learn more, people will learn in their own time and in their own ways. But it's this paper that we published also in 2020. This was the results of our national impact study. We used the data from our climate change in the American Mind surveys, which again, we've conducted every 6 months since 2008 onward, which creates an incredible baseline to understand how public opinion, what public opinion looks like in every media market in America over the course of a dozen years. And so what we sought to do with this impact evaluation is ask and answer the question, are we seeing a dose-response relationship between how successful we have been in changing the behavior of TV weathercasters to encourage and enable them to report on climate change? So that's the dose, if you will, the reporting on climate change by weathercasters, and the response that we were looking for and testing in our climate change in the American Mind surveys was improved understanding of climate change as a personally relevant problem. And again, it's a very technical paper. It took us a long time to do this research and a long time to get it published. But basically, the bottom line is, yes, we were seeing a dose-response relationship in the community, holding all kinds of other factors constant in this analysis, including, and perhaps most importantly, how red or blue the community was. Because as you all know all too well, climate change is a hyper-polarized issue in America. And so we want to make sure that our weathercasters who are reporting on this are getting, are doing, if possible, are doing a good job of bringing Americans together in seeing this issue in a common reality-based, evidence-based way. And so holding constant how red and blue the given media markets are, and all kinds of other relevant media market related factors, what we saw exactly as expected is in markets where we were doing a better job of empowering weathercasters to report on climate change as a local problem, people's views about climate change, people's understanding about climate change as a local, personally relevant problem were increasing at a faster rate. We were incredibly excited by this finding because it was really the validation of 10 years of I'll call it hard labor, but as you could tell, working with people like Bernadette, this was fun labor every step of the way. We have really had a good time developing and running this program. So that last summer, we summarized, we had our 10th anniversary of the national launch in 2020. We did the national scale up in 2012. We started it. And in 2022, we felt it was time to celebrate our 10th anniversary. And so we wrote a summary paper that was published in Nature Climate Change. It's a very short piece. In that piece, though, we make the claim that Climate Matters is the only climate education campaign, nationwide climate education campaign, that has ever been shown to actually be making a difference. We are incredible. Somebody may eventually debunk my claim, but this is not a claim I make lightly. We have looked, and we can't find any published evaluation data on other climate education campaigns, national climate education campaigns that are working in the US. Our dear friend and colleague, Frank Niepold, who runs climate education at NOAA, we love his quote. He says that Climate Matters is some of the most important work on climate literacy to be having an impact at a national scale for our country. So coming back to the morals, what I see as the moral of the story, you take away whatever morals you like, but this is the moral of the story as far as I'm concerned. We have worked really hard to help TV weathercasters deliver simple, clear messages, often over the past decade, through their trusted and caring voices. And we have shown through this Climate Matters impact research, we've shown it's making a difference in terms of helping the public understand the realities of climate change in their community. And we've done what I consider to be we've certainly changed the behavior of the broadcast meteorology community, which was, in the end, what we're really after is Americans and individually and collectively making better decisions about how to respond to climate change. But our theory of change, we had to actually change the behavior of TV weathercasters to get there. And I hope that Bernadette has convinced you in her presentation that we have succeeded in changing the behavior of the broadcast meteorology community by making reporting on climate change easy for them, fun in terms of helping them achieve the goals of their station, like WLTX going from third in the Nielsen ratings to first, and ultimately popular. The fact that we now, in 2010, we learned that half of America's weathercasters said they would like to do this work, and now in 2023, half of them are doing this work. They are doing this work with us, and we are enormously proud of that. And you can participate. As Bernadette said, just go ahead and hold your phone up to that QR code. It will take you to the sign up page on Climate Central's website. You will be asked where you live. You might be asked where your media market is, but that's okay. It's a synonymous question to where you live, and wherever you say, whatever you put in there, those are the localized Climate Matters materials that you will receive pretty much every Wednesday in your inbox. How you choose to use them, totally up to you. I can say on behalf of both Bernadette and I, delight us in innovating with these local education materials. We don't control the market on how these things get used. We design them with one thing in mind, weathercasters and eventually journalists, but we are continually delighted to see how other people in other communities of practice are using these materials. So with that, Bernadette, any final word? Otherwise, we could take questions.
Yeah, I think we're ready for questions.
Right.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you both so much. I think this was such a great example of really demonstrating the power of stories. I mean, what an exciting story, and to see the real impact that you've had so far. So thank you. And you've gotten a lot of love and a lot of questions in the chat. First, DTG says, it's a wonderful initiative and a story worth telling again and again to different audiences. And they ask how the introduction of weather apps on smartphones hindered the ability for weathercasters to have direct communication with their audiences.
Lauren, that one's got your name all over.
Yeah, that's a great question. I look at it as another tool. I mean, people are consuming so much information in so many different ways. It's not usually just one source. Now, I mean, I have a lot of my own personal views on apps because I do think that they're helpful if you use them correctly. But when I'm sitting at a ball game and someone's like, well, it's going to rain at 2:00, but it's going to stop at 3 and it's going to start again at 4, I just pause, because it's what we're trying to tell you is a story through that app, that there's scattered showers and check your radar, right? So I do think that there's some limitations to apps in the way they've been created. However, often it can prompt more. If you see on apps, there's a lot of ways that link out to other things, or that are often connected with TV stations and these meteorologists themselves, and then you could bring to their video or their social media feed to tell you more. So we're not just in an isolated field anymore. Now, to that point, I would say one of my frustrations still with apps are they've got a lot of weather info, but not a lot of climate info, right? And so we're trying to work with a couple of app providers right now to get more climate info into those. And there are a lot of ways we can do that. I mean, the CSI, this Climate Shift Index, is a daily feed. The Weather Power Tool is a daily feed. There's ways to connect weather with climate through an app. And maybe I'll tell anyone, if you're in contact with app people, let them know you want more climate information. It's one of those things that we're trying to move forward.
All right, and then Dan Farrell asks about the changing understanding of climate science in the Weathercaster community and how this is translated into broader understanding or acceptance within the general public.
Yeah, the questions that we use to evaluate the impact of our work, we do ask about public understanding of the fact that the weather is changing in their community, but that's not really what we're looking at for. We would see that as sort of an interim indicator of success. Ultimately, we're looking for people. Something I didn't say in my introduction, but I often do say, is when we started this project, the average American absolutely accepted the realities of climate change, but they saw it as a distant problem. Distant in space, meaning somewhere else, not my community, probably not my country. Distant in time. This was 2010, and people were seeing it as a 2050 or a 2100 problem, not a 2010 problem. And fundamentally, or most importantly, distant in species. So plants, penguins, and especially polar bears, for sure. When we ask people, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words global warming? Most people say polar bears or something like that. But the purpose, the simple, clear message that we're looking to get out through Climate Matters is that global climate change is changing the conditions in your community already, and not for the better. I mean, yes, I do enjoy an occasional warm winter day where I can go outside without my coat on. I think that's lovely, but I need to understand that that's part of a pattern that's also causing extreme heat waves in my Washington, D.C. media market, in my neighborhood, and that it was that sense of enhancing personal relevance, reducing psychological distance that people experience when they think about the issue of climate change. That was fundamentally what we're trying to get across with this reporting. And those are the metrics that we have shown are changing. So it really is heightened engagement. We don't actually, because of the nature of this project, we don't actually link that to specific types of behavior change or even specific support for specific public policy responses. And we don't do that intentionally. We don't do that. We don't link it to generating increased support for public policy, because members of the broadcast meteorology community, they are part of the community of journalists, and journalists don't want to be seen, or don't want to be used as part of a policy advocacy agenda. That's the simplest, clearest way I can explain it. So we're trying to be true to our partners in the broadcast meteorology community and help them educate their viewers, because they're all about that. They don't want to be seen as playing part in a policy advocacy agenda, which could be seen as nonpartisan. And in fact, in much of my work, I do engage in policy advocacy in a nonpartisan way. But for this program, we felt it was necessary and the correct thing to do to be true to our partners and how they see their role in their community. Want to add to that, Bernadette? Because you, as an actual member of that community, as opposed to an honorary member of that community, you will have even more insight into that sensitivity.
I do think it's interesting how, as a meteorologist, many people may not realize the the goal you have to keep people safe and prepared. That really is a driving force. Yes, you're fascinated by storms, and that's what brings you in. And this is a really interesting community because we love weather, absolutely love weather, and love telling everyone how much we love weather, right? So, but you quickly see the damage, you quickly see the harm, and so you want to keep people safe and prepared. And so climate change is that on bigger, longer, more impactful scales. And so there really is this drive to keep people safe and prepared. Now, that's why we approach it that way. It's the extremes, it's the big shocks of weather that you get, but it's also the everyday changes that we're seeing, which are impacting health, they're impacting tourism, they're impacting economies, they're impacting sports, they're impacting our cultural ways of life and shifting our ecosystems and what we plant when and where and how. And it's also making those connections for people too, so that we can be prepared for what we're already dealing with, let alone what's coming our way. And then, as we said, it's also a form of energy, of renewable energy going forward. So there's a lot that falls under weather. And the more we worked with meteorologists, the more they understood and were able to really be the leaders on this. It's amazing in newsrooms across America how we're seeing any remote climate story being handing off to meteorologists versus journalists sometimes too. So it is really interesting how they've embraced this and taken it to a new level. Another thing I'd say just in general for journalism, there wasn't the sense of questioning the science as much by the time we really engaged with the journalism community, but there was a gap in understanding of what that means. And there's so many reasons for that. I mean, one was we presented to the world, hey, is it changing or not? And people made their decision and moved on, but no one really got into what does that mean? Where's it coming from? What can we do? And so the more we were able to really build that foundation, which we're still doing, we're seeing this really unfold in so many different stories. And even starting with simple connections, because almost every journalist is thrown into weather somewhere, even if you can make those connections and start asking those questions, we're seeing it build and blossom into so much more impactful storytelling. So the goal, as you saw from the quote earlier, for journalism is to inform communities and answer questions that are being asked. And we know through all of Ed's research, through his public work, of that people have questions. They know something's happening. They don't always know what and how and when and what can be done. And here's an opportunity to help answer those questions.
So Alan Raymond posted a question in the chat to you, Bernadette, about what percentage of the 839 local news producing TV stations in the US are using this material? You want to go ahead?
I don't have the exact answer, Alan, but we have about 90% of the markets. I don't know how many stations within those markets, but we have about 90% of the markets. And sometimes the reason that has fluctuated is, you understand, Alan, having been a broadcaster yourself, is that people move, right? So they take it with them. It's not that one market was willing to or wasn't per se, it was the person was willing to or not.
And Alan also asked about the role, indirectly, Alan asked about the role of consultants in the news industry, which is really interesting. And Alan, I'm so glad you asked that question, because just quite by chance, I happened to go to graduate school with a man named Seth Geiger, who is the president of Smith Geiger, the leading news consulting organization in America. And when I first started talking to Seth about this challenge and opportunity, he actually was very bullish about it. And he and his company, Smith Geiger, have really played an important role in helping their clients, news stations around the country, recognize this as an opportunity. An opportunity to actually, coming back to the earlier question about weather apps and why would people pay attention to what a local TV weathercaster has to say when we've all got a weather app on our phone? And the news consultants at Smith Geiger, and I'm sure elsewhere, are saying, no, actually, you have to work twice as hard to keep people coming back. And you can use your websites, and you can use your broadcast meteorologists can use their social media feeds to bring people back to the live broadcasts, because that's how you're going to keep the fiscal sustainability of your station going. So we've actually had news consultants really play an important role in helping us achieve that 50% penetration rate in the broadcast meteorology community.
And Alan, it has evolved. I don't know when you left television, but I remember even when I was on TV, and it wasn't even climate, it was just There was a shift for a while of just go more local and just read things and not add value, right? And with the explosion of technology and apps and different ways of getting your information, not just apps, but the whole digital world, there really was a shift back to value add. And that's being the station scientist. That's being the person who knows this content and can tell a story around it. And so there was some education needed out for other consultants to help them understand, but there has been a shift.
And Sean, to answer your question, all of the TV stations in a given market can participate. It's totally up to them. I think for a while, some of our rapid uptake was associated with stations who wanted to get in first in their market. But we clearly have lots of examples of multiple stations in a market using the materials.
And we made sure not to be exclusive for that reason. Our goal is to get people to tell these stories.
So Bern, why don't you take us out on Show Your Stripes Day?
Absolutely. So this is, as I was saying, fun, right? So there's a lot about climate change that's not fun, especially when you're talking about weather. As we advance our solutions, there is a lot more fun out there. But this is a fun one, even though the image is representing the awful increase in temperature. It really draws people in. People have questions. Oh, what is that? What is that design? It's a prompt for doing something around climate change, whether you are a broadcaster and can broadcast something, or use your social media feed, or have conversations in your neighborhood, whatever it may be. Use Stripes Day as a prompt to do something about starting a climate conversation. I put a link in there for last year's content. We'll update it. It's not going to change that much. It's adding another red for most places, quite honestly, on the right-hand side there. But the idea is there's a lot of ways you can take your climate conversations. And here's a day that many people are going to do that.
And you are producing localized climate stripes, correct?
We do. We have the local, there's state ones. I mean, it is amazing how many people have picked this up. There's like beer companies putting it on cans across parts of Europe. There's a rock band that made it part of their set. There's a designer in London who brought it into her fashion show. Like, there's so many cool ways people are doing this. So get creative.
Excellent. Thank you. Miriam, we turn it back over to you.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you have time for one final closing question, I think you've gotten a lot of feedback that this is just a really wonderful initiative. What's next? How do you scale this up in other countries or in other places?
It's a great question. We're working on some of it right now. It's been more project-based with the global TV weather presenters, but this is where there's so many differences, right? How people consume information, how they use TV or radio in a lot of African villages, or social media in certain places. So there's a lot that has to be thought through on this, but at this point, there is a global community, and there is a big push in the global community, especially through the UN right now, for early warnings, because a lot of countries don't have the assets we do right now in the United States with data and information and warning systems. And so we've been working with a lot of the global TV weather presenters, and it's slightly different, but it's the same concept. It's keeping people safe and prepared.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you both so much. And thank you all to you, the attendees, for this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at next month's webinar. Registration link will be posted shortly.